"You kids are too stupid to own real estate anyway." Arthur said this loud enough to cut through the clinking of heavy silver on fine china. He said it in front of 14 extended family members at his annual holiday dinner, sitting at the head of a massive mahogany table. He didn't even bother to look at me when he delivered the insult. He looked directly at my husband, David, swirling the amber liquid in his crystal scotch glass with a slow, deliberate rhythm. The dining room went dead silent. Nobody defended us. Nobody ever did. My name is Clara. I am 29 years old. This is the story of how my father-in-law forged my signature to steal our $400,000 dream home while I was under general anesthesia, and how David and I handed the Federal Bureau of Investigation the exact evidence they needed to arrest him in broad daylight. Arthur was a man who believed the oxygen in the room belonged to him first. He ran a regional logistics and property management firm, and he governed our family with the same ruthless, autocratic grip he used on his contractors. His sprawling house always smelled of imported leather and expensive, suffocating cologne. Every relationship in his life was a calculated transaction. At the top of his hierarchy was his golden child daughter, who received six-figure business loans and luxury cars as rewards for her blind obedience. At the absolute bottom was David. David was the reliable utility. He was the son expected to fix the failing HVAC systems at Arthur's commercial properties on Sunday mornings. The son expected to listen, nod, and accept whatever scraps of conditional approval Arthur decided to toss his way. Arthur thrived on keeping David feeling financially inferior, offering help that always came with invisible strings and a heavy tax on our dignity. So, when David and I quietly saved our own money and bought a beautiful 4-bedroom colonial with a wraparound porch, Arthur didn't congratulate us. He looked at the property like it was a declaration of war. We had secured a $400,000 asset without his money, without his co-signature, and most importantly, without his permission. To a man like Arthur, our independence was a profound personal insult. He spent the first year of our homeownership walking through our hallways, pointing out imaginary structural flaws, criticizing our mortgage terms, and planting seeds of doubt. But the condescension was merely a smokescreen. He wasn't just criticizing our home, he was appraising it. He was already charting a path to take it from us. He thought because David was quiet, David was manageable. He thought because I was young and dealing with chronic health issues, I was an easy mark. When my doctor scheduled me for a severe invasive spinal surgery, Arthur didn't see a daughter-in-law in pain. He saw an operational window, a tactical distraction. He thought we would be too broken to notice the paperwork. 3 months after we closed on the house, Arthur showed up unannounced on a Tuesday morning. He didn't ring the doorbell. He just unlocked the side door with a spare key David had foolishly given him for emergencies. He walked in holding a brass-clipped clipboard, followed by a man he casually introduced as his personal property appraiser. The house still smelled of fresh linen and the sandalwood candles we had burned the night before. Arthur walked straight into our newly renovated kitchen, tracking dirt across the hardwood. He dragged a calloused finger over the edge of the quartz countertop, stopping to inspect the dust on his skin. He didn't greet me. He looked entirely past me to the appraiser. "She picked porous stone," Arthur said, his tone flat and clinical. "They'll stain it within 6 months. They don't have the discipline or the capital to maintain a property of this caliber." I was standing less than 3 feet away, holding my morning coffee. I felt the sudden urge to demand he leave, but I knew the rules of his game. Any emotional reaction would be categorized as hysterics. I didn't argue. I simply took a slow sip of my coffee, set the mug precisely on a coaster, and watched him tap his knuckles against our drywall. I offered him nothing. The disparagement became a steady, suffocating drumbeat, escalating dramatically 12 days before my surgery. We were required to attend Arthur's 65th birthday brunch at the Oak Ridge Country Club, We were seated near the edge of the patio, surrounded by 40 of Arthur's high-net-worth associates. The midday sun was blinding, and the heavy scent of roasted lamb and stale cigar smoke made my stomach turn. My lower spine was in agonizing pain. I shifted in the wrought-iron patio chair, just trying to relieve the pressure on my nerves. Arthur caught the subtle movement. He stopped his conversation with a local real estate developer, locked eyes with me, and raised his voice so the surrounding tables fell silent. "Look at her wincing," Arthur scoffed, gesturing at me with his silver fork. "David needs a partner who can help him build a portfolio, not a permanent patient. A $400,000 house requires a functional woman, Clara, not a financial liability." The clinking of glassware stopped entirely. I felt the sharp sting of humiliation prick at my eyes, but I kept my hands folded loosely in my lap. I didn't break eye contact. I looked right back at him, my expression completely blank, forcing him to sit in the awkward, heavy silence of his own cruelty.
I learned very early in life that arguing with my father was like trying to punch a concrete wall. It only shattered your own hand. So, when Arthur humiliated Clara on that country club patio, I didn't flip the table. I didn't shout. I simply stood up, placed a $50 bill over my untouched coffee, offered my arm to my wife, and walked her to the car in complete silence. Arthur mistook my silence for submission. He always did. 3 days before Clara's surgery, my father summoned me to his logistics office on the west side of town. The room smelled of stale cigar smoke and ozone from the heavy-duty printers. He slid a manila folder across his massive glass desk. It was an unsolicited, comprehensive risk assessment he had commissioned on our house. He tapped his Mont Blanc pen against the cover. "You are playing house, David," Arthur stated, not looking up from his ledger. "You let a sick woman co-sign a 30-year note on a $400,000 asset. When her medical bills bankrupt you both, I will not bail you out. A smart man protects his equity from a sinking ship." I picked up the folder. I didn't defend my wife to a man incapable of understanding her value. I just looked at the silver hair at his temples, realizing for the first time that I felt absolutely nothing for him. No anger, just a cold, clinical detachment. The line was finally crossed 72 hours later. Clara was in the operating room. I was sitting in a vinyl chair in the surgical waiting center. The room smelled overwhelmingly of industrial bleach and burnt cafeteria coffee. The wall clock read exactly 10:14 a.m. My phone vibrated against my leg. It was an automated email alert from the county clerk's property registry, a service I had set up months ago when Arthur first started lingering around our hallways. The subject line read, "Deed transfer initiated, parcel 402. I opened the attached PDF. It was a quitclaim deed, transferring our $400,000 home into the name of Arthur's holding company. And there, at the bottom of the second page, was Clara's signature. It was dated that exact morning, a morning she had spent entirely unconscious under general anesthesia, surrounded by a surgical team. My father hadn't just insulted my wife. He had forged her name, bribed a notary, and stolen our home while surgeons were cutting into her spine.
I woke up in the recovery room. The anesthesia was still heavy in my veins. The tight, enclosed space smelled of sharp iodine and sterile linens. David was sitting in the plastic corner chair. He wasn't pacing. He wasn't holding his head in his hands. He sat perfectly still, his posture rigid, staring at a bright PDF on his phone screen. I watched her open her eyes. She was pale, fighting the heavy haze of the surgical narcotics, but her focus was absolute. I didn't ask how she felt. I didn't offer empty, fragile comforts. I simply stood up, walked to the edge of the metal bed, and turned my screen toward her. I read the document. I saw the county clerk's timestamp. I saw my own forged signature at the bottom of the quitclaim deed, legally transferring our $400,000 home to Arthur's holding company. I waited for the shock. I expected her heart monitors to spike in panic. Instead, my wife simply blinked against the harsh fluorescent light. Her expression hardened into a cold, terrifying calm. Did he use his in-house notary? I asked, my voice dry and barely a whisper. Yes, I said. He filed the transfer exactly an hour ago. I looked up at the acoustic ceiling tiles. The surgical pain in my lower spine was agonizing, but it felt incredibly distant now. It was completely replaced by a profound, chilling clarity. We didn't need to yell. We didn't need to confront a man who viewed us as easy prey. We are going to let him take it, I said quietly. We are going to let him commit the felony completely. I locked my phone and slid it into my pocket, and then, I said, we let the federal agents take him. 4 days after my surgery, I was discharged. I wore a rigid polymer back brace that rubbed against my collarbone every time I shifted my weight. The physical pain was constant, but my mind had never been sharper. I didn't go home to rest. I had David drive me directly to the medical records department on the ground floor of the hospital. The small administrative office smelled of old paper and the ozone from heavy-duty copiers. I sat across from a records clerk named Marcus. I needed one very specific piece of paper. I need the complete time-stamped anesthesia logs from my procedure on Tuesday morning, I told him, keeping my voice perfectly flat. Marcus typed on his mechanical keyboard, the sharp clicks echoing in the quiet room. 10 minutes later, he handed me a sealed, notarized envelope. Inside was a certified surgical report signed by the head of anesthesiology, Dr. Eris Thorne. The document detailed my exact medical state down to the minute. At exactly 10:14 a.m., the precise moment Arthur's in-house notary claimed I was sitting in a logistics office signing away a $400,000 asset. My medical records proved I was entirely unconscious, intubated, and heavily dosed with surgical-grade propofol. It was an irrefutable alibi, a biological impossibility for me to have held a pen. Arthur had assumed that because I was hospitalized, I was helpless. He fundamentally misunderstood how federal paper trails work. He thought his forged signature was a masterstroke of corporate theft. He didn't realize he had just handed me a neatly packaged, undeniable case of identity theft. I didn't call Arthur. I didn't warn him. I placed the certified medical logs into a stiff leather folder. I traced the edge of the file with my thumb, feeling the sharp corner of the heavy cardstock. I had my piece of the weapon.
While Clara was securing her medical logs, I drove across town to the industrial park where Arthur headquartered his logistics firm. The air outside smelled of burning diesel and hot asphalt from the idling freight trucks. I sat in my car for exactly 2 minutes, staring at the tinted glass of his corner office. Then, I opened the voice memo app on my phone, hit record, and slid the device into my breast pocket. I walked past his receptionist and straight through his heavy oak door. The room was freezing, humming with the low vibration of the server rack in the corner. Arthur was reviewing a stack of invoices. He didn't look up when I entered. I saw the county registry alert, I said, keeping my voice deliberately soft, playing the role of the defeated, submissive son he had conditioned me to be. I know you transferred the deed to the holding company. Arthur set his pen down. He leaned back in his leather executive chair, steepling his fingers. He looked at me not with guilt, but with the profound, arrogant satisfaction of a man who believed he had just won a chess match against a child. I saved you from a sinking ship, David, Arthur stated, his voice ringing with absolute authority. Clara was never going to authorize the transfer, so I took the initiative. My notary understands loyalty over red tape. I signed your name to protect my equity. You kids are too stupid to own real estate anyway. My heart didn't race. My hands didn't shake. I simply stood there, letting the heavy silence stretch between us, absorbing the sheer magnitude of his arrogance. He had just openly confessed to felony forgery and conspiracy to commit wire fraud, believing his power made him completely immune to consequence. I understand, I said quietly. I turned and walked out of the freezing office. As soon as the heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, I reached into my pocket and stopped the recording. I looked at the bright screen. I had a crystal clear 3-minute and 42-second WAV file. Arthur thought he had just put me in my place. He had no idea he had just handed me the padlock to his own prison cell.
Exactly 48 hours after Arthur recorded his own confession, David and I walked through the heavy glass doors of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's regional field office. The waiting area was sterile, smelling faintly of floor wax and stale coffee. We were escorted into a windowless interview room. I slid the stiff leather folder across the steel table. I watched Special Agent Miller examine the certified anesthesia logs, tracing the timestamp that proved I was surgically unconscious the exact moment my signature was forged. I placed my phone on the table next to Clara's medical records. I pressed play. Arthur's arrogant, booming voice filled the small room, cleanly admitting to bribing his notary and committing felony fraud to steal a $400,000 asset. Agent Miller didn't ask us any clarifying questions. He simply stopped the recording, locked his office door, picked up his desk phone, and authorized an immediate arrest warrant. The prosecutor told us to go home and wait. But we didn't go home. We knew exactly where Arthur was. It was the last Friday of the month, which meant he was hosting his quarterly investors' luncheon at the Oak Ridge Country Club. We drove to the club in mere silence. I could feel the rigid polymer brace pressing into my spine with every bump in the road, but the pain was entirely eclipsed by the cold anticipation of what was about to happen. We walked onto the familiar wrought iron patio. The air was thick with the smell of roasted lamb, expensive cigars, and old money. Arthur was sitting at the head of a long table, surrounded by 40 of his most lucrative business partners. He saw us approaching. His eyes narrowed, and that familiar, calculated smirk touched the corners of his mouth. He thought we had come to beg. He raised his silver fork, preparing to deliver another public humiliation, but the words died in his throat. Special Agent Miller and 3 armed federal officers in tactical windbreakers stepped onto the patio from the side entrance. They didn't ask for permission to interrupt. Miller walked directly up behind Arthur's chair and announced the felony indictment for wire fraud and identity theft at full volume. Every single guest at the table froze. The silence that followed was absolute. Arthur's chest stopped moving, the silver fork slipping from his fingers and clattering loudly against his fine china plate as the heavy steel handcuffs were ratcheted tightly onto his wrists. That was his entire physical reaction, a sudden total paralysis of the man realizing his kingdom had just vaporized. The high-net-worth developers he had spent years courting immediately pushed their wrought iron chairs back, physically recoiling from him to avoid the splash zone of a federal indictment. Arthur looked at us, his eyes wide and panicked, silently demanding that we intervene and save him. I looked down at the man who had demanded my submission for 32 years. "You were right about one thing," I said, my voice low but carrying perfectly across the silent patio. "I am protecting my equity." I stood shoulder to shoulder with my husband. I didn't smile, I didn't gloat. I just looked at the handcuffs cutting into his wrists. "And we are fully capable of maintaining our property," I said.
Arthur's logistics firm collapsed under the weight of the federal investigation before his trial even began. His high-net-worth investors pulled their capital within 72 hours of the arrest on the country club patio. His golden child daughter, terrified of being implicated in the financial fallout, immediately severed all contact and liquidated her own assets to distance herself. Arthur is currently serving a 48-month sentence in a minimum security federal correctional institution. He receives no visitors. We didn't celebrate the sentencing. The gavel striking the sound block wasn't a victory. It was simply the conclusion of a boundary being enforced. My spine healed exactly as the surgeons promised. The heavy polymer brace eventually came off, and I now spend my mornings drinking coffee at my own court's countertop. I lost the dangerous illusion that blood demands absolute loyalty, but I gained the quiet, unshakable certainty that my peace is not up for negotiation. My father spent his entire life measuring his worth by what he could control, and evaluating people by what he could extract from them. He sat at the head of a massive mahogany table and assumed my silence was a permanent symptom of weakness. He fundamentally misunderstood the mechanics of power. We still live in our four-bedroom colonial. The deed is secured in a steel deposit box, the locks have been entirely replaced, and the air inside our house finally belongs to us. He mistook my patience for surrender. I am a quiet man, but I am the one holding the deed.